This video focuses on Amiri Baraka's The Motion of History, which he wrote back in 1974-75 and had it first produced in New Jersey in 1978. I've already mentioned in the African American video that Baraka is a very unique figure in American literature and an innovator, a distinctive voice as far as articulating not only African American perspective on American cultural life, but also he brings to his writing an innovative spirit, desire to invent new forms or revise the forms which are traditional in all areas of literature. He's a poet, a dramatist. He's written novels and essays, nonfiction works. So he's very diverse in his in the application of his great writing skill. But in the theater, he has been enormously prolific and developed ways of writing drama and incorporating unique theatrical techniques to articulate his unique political and social perspective on American life. I also mentioned earlier in the African American video that he had set up a theater in Newark, New Jersey, where he lives, that separated itself from the theater institutions in New York City, where he had previously worked and tried, or had set up his career. But in the early 70s, he moved to Newark and set up a theater that was supposedly only for black. And he wanted to create this environment that demonstrated to the white mainstream what it felt like to be discriminated against. Anyway, The Motion of History is a part of this project that he had going on in the 1970s in Newark, to create a unique form of African American theater which would advance the struggle of black people for greater power over their lives and a more influential presence in American politics and American culture. His whole approach to theater and the history of African American life in the United States contrasts very dramatically with August Wilson, whom I'll discuss later in regard to his play, Fences. But the Motion of History is one of, I don't know, he must have written about 50 or 60 plays by this time, mostly in one-act form. He's very good in this very compressed episodic kind of theater, but in The Motion of History, big scale here, and dramatized the entire struggle of African Americans for greater freedom and better control of their lives and destinies. So he's written here in The Motion of History a history play. What is The Motion of History? The play isn't done very often. I can't remember the last time it was done since the 1970s. That doesn't mean it's unimportant, because it's not performed often. Many very fine plays are not performed often for reasons that have nothing much to do with the quality of the play, but with the conditions under which the play can be staged. So he has a history play here, The Motion of History, with a very large cast. The cast of characters far exceeds what most theater companies are able to afford in the way of support for plays. And in that respect, Amiri Baraka is much out of the norm for the 1970s and seeking a much larger cast for his play than most theaters could reasonably expect to supply. But history involves many, many people. The tide of history, the motion of history involves the actions, motives, desires, and aspirations of multitudes of people, and it's difficult to capture or represent that multitudinous motion or movement of history with a chamber play involving 4 or 5 characters. It just does not resonate with the kind of urgency and excitement that a large cast play offers in relation to historical themes. So it's a very large cast. He mixes real historical characters with fictional characters. So we have people from the time of Jamestown settlement in the 17th century, Governor and Lord Berkeley, and then going down through some of the other historical figures, such as Martin Luther King and Malcolm X and Elijah Muhammad, Roy Wilkins in there, and other real historical personages are a part of the play. He puts them in there along with fictional characters who represent the people living at the various times in which the action takes place. Play also requires complex scenic support, shifting from one scene to another in these diverse historical environments, moving from Jamestown settlements to slave plantations to factories and meeting place churches and apartments and abodes in which people live. So it's got to put all of this onto one stage is really quite a challenge. So in addition to a large cast, even if you put this play on with actors playing multiple roles, it's quite demanding to try and stage it all and put it together. Combined with complex scenic requirements that require the stage to transform almost instantaneously from the present to the past to the present, back and forth, and quite exciting, but it does take quite a bit of patience to put it all together. It's a montage approach to history. It's the juxtaposition of one time with another in kind of swift-flowing narrative style that allows the past and the present to intersect. Well, it's more than intersect. It's a juxtaposition. He wants a kind of shocking placement of the past next to the present. So he goes back in time, then moves from the Jamestown settlement into the 1830s, and then back into the 1820s, and he does not follow a linear chronological approach to the action or the time in which the action takes place. And that is part of the montage technique that comes often, well, primarily from film, cinema. So he's incorporating that into the stage, but he does not want a linear or progressive approach to history or action on the stage, but seeks to move from one time in the past to another time in the past to another time in the present, back and forth, 1822, 1831, 1876, 1660, Jamestown. or the 1960s with Martin Luther King and the civil rights struggle, in the 1950s, the 1930s, and always orienting these past events to the present, which is set up at the beginning of the play with black man and the white man coming out of a movie onto the stage, as if there was this film of history as a whole that they make real by stepping out of the film onto the stage, and the action subsequently flows from the stage, rather than from some cinematic unraveling of history. So he wants to capture, Baraka wants to capture large-scale events, episodic actions, but he also wants to capture a range of voices from different classes of people. So slaves, workers of various types. Then he's got the rednecks in there with Reese and Rogers. Different kinds of white people who represent like the counterculture, the hippies, or the psychedelic white people, but also these ruling class types that sort of guide the governance of peoples at different times, like the white plantation owner who's trying to persuade the rednecks that they should oppose or fight any kind of alliance with the blacks who are similarly situated economically to them. So that's another unique thing about the play, is the range of voices that Baraka seems to play, and succeeds. I think he manages to capture in just a few lines the voices of groups of people or classes of sectors of the population. So the motion of history is this power of past actions and events and decisions to shape the present moment. It's about the desire, or rather you could say the desire for freedom drives the motion of history. But throughout the play suggests this desire for freedom is perpetually compromised by fundamental class interest. And that's where Baraka is distinct from, say, Lorraine Hansberry, and also August Wilson, and certainly many other authors in the United States. Baraka proposes a Marxist solution to racial and class conflicts within the United States. He dramatizes the idea that racial conflict is a strategy developed by the ruling classes to preserve control over the economy, the resources in which available to society, and keep wages low and entire sectors of the population down, submissive, and dependent on, always dependent on some higher class of people for their survival. So it's definitely about class conflict, and from Baraka's perspective, racial conflict will only be resolved when oppressed classes of any racial identity unite and gather to work together to achieve the goal of emancipation or freedom from constraints on their opportunities in life. So That's not quite the integrationist message that Hansberry put forth in A Raisin in the Sun, and it's definitely not the integrationist message that came forth primarily from the white sector of American society through the Civil Rights Act, whereby the government passed a law stating that discrimination against anyone for the color of their skin is illegal. Baraka goes a lot farther. He says that it's not enough to be against discrimination. It's not enough to propose that blacks and whites live together in some kind of integrationist idea of a healthy society. He believes that some kind of revolution is necessary to transform the lives of so many people who otherwise are oppressed or denied opportunities that they deserve. And that revolution is will only happen when oppressed classes, regardless of their color or their gender, unite and fight together against these other classes that are above them and are responsible for their oppression. So action in the play is driven by ideological values. The class identity of the characters determines their motives, and everything that the characters say in the play is a matter of making a political choice. It seems like there's no utterance in the play that is free of some decisive political perspective. And that's because Baraka believes that true concentrations of power are in that class identity, and not in any kind of individual level of ambition. So you don't turn to Baraka's play or The Motion of History because you're going to learn much about the psychology of characters. He's not deeply interested in psychology, and he's not interested in trying to show how personalities transform or evolve or change as a result of understanding the world differently or better. He's really only interested in how a character is representative of a political perspective, and that political perspective is the same as a class identity. All characters speak in relation to where they are on some kind of hierarchy of class designation. At the same time, though, I can't say that Baraka presents characters as caricatures. They're not cartoon characters. They're not. The play is not a satire. It's not a comic play. So the characters have a kind of seriousness about them and a depth that prevents them from sinking into caricature. And in that respect, Baraka shows the power of ideological perspectives to define identities. These class identities are decisive in shaping who you are from his perspective, and who you are is not a small matter in terms of class identity, or class identity is not irrelevant to that. It is decisive. And he's pretty successful, I think, at showing that, because even though characters are in the play, they have no big roles. They're all small in terms of the number of lines they have or the number of times they appear on the stage, and yet they have a memorable intensity to them that does not require an elaborate characterization and takes all night to get through them to understand the characters. The characters are pretty understandable and at the same time pretty serious and have a kind of depth to them, despite their not having much time on the stage to reveal themselves. So from Baraka's Marxist perspective, freedom, which is the theme of the play, and how the motion of history is the story of this movement toward freedom. For Baraka, freedom implies movement toward a world in which identity is no longer constructed around class economic affiliations. That's the Marxist ideal, is that we move to some kind of society where we don't have this segmentation or discrimination between classes of people, the rich and middle class and lower class, and we have much more equal distribution of resources. That may indeed be an illusion to even assume that such a world is possible. It's definitely what the Marxists dreamed of when during the Cold War and before that. And I'm not asking you to accept it, because I don't buy it myself, but I'm certainly not asking you to say that Baraka's view of history and its meaning is authoritative or more persuasive than other versions of history. My point is that he makes a big play as a result of having a big theme. That theme can't be dramatized without relying on the kind of, I don't think it can be dramatized successfully, I would say. It can't be dramatized without relying on the techniques that Baraka employs to transmit his message. It's regardless of whether you believe the message or not, the play is remarkable because of the extraordinary creative imagination that went into organizing the action and dramatizing this theme that of class identities fundamentally shaping racial conflict, and the motion of history depends, or the motion of history toward this greater freedom entails this release from this devotion, that's the word, devotion to preserving class identities. So it's a remarkable play for that reason, and it's in strong contrast to August Wilson's version of history, which I'll talk about in the next video.